Athens City Council. It's Monday, June 12th, 7:02 p.m. Tonight, we have a series of 4 committee meetings followed by a special session where we will be reading through some of our ordinances. For Committee of the Whole, the topic for discussion tonight is the Ridges development, and you might notice that there are 3 items. Before we delve into discussion, questions, comments on those 3 items, I'll give just a little bit of background information for people who might be listening tonight. Our current discussions about the Ridges began in November of 2022 with some of our first discussion of the community authority. It was Mr. Ritchie was present and described some of this and how it might work in implementing the restoration of the Ridges. And that was in concert with the OU framework plan. As envisioned, it would include senior housing, artisan live-work units, owner-occupied business opportunities, and commercial properties. Following that, in 2023, on February 27th, we had a description of the community authority and the next steps of legislation required to move that forward. In parallel, the Ohio University Board of Trustees reviewed and approved the concept. May 22nd, so just a few weeks ago, 2023, we had a 1-reading resolution, that was R-523, that said the petition to create the authority is sufficient and complies with Ohio Revised Code 349.03. And now tonight we have 3 documents that council members and administration have received. These documents have been prepared by the development company, reviewed by Bricker and Eckler, and also then thoroughly reviewed by our clerk of council and our law director. And many thanks for all of the hours it's taken to move this through in the past few weeks. The purchase agreement discusses the release of some of the park land that's owned by the city. It's approximately 6.3 acre parcel and a 1.8 acre parcel of the 19 acres owned by the city. And then there's the resolution that creates the community authority and the resolution to appoint the board. When council members have reviewed portions of these documents previously, you may remember that our petition, the original petition document that was presented, had the maps, our city code, Title 23, also the market analysis for the development of the Ridges. And the only item for first reading tonight is the purchase agreement with the Ridges Community Development, LLC. And that is, part of that land is needed for infrastructure improvements to help make the Ridges development possible. And the document does contain written description and maps. I think the main amendment to that document has been the labeling of the hash marked areas, indicating that that is the land that is under consideration for purchase. And just a little bit fast forward, just so you know where this is, and then in the final picture, what we're doing is once again trying to move in parallel and in concert with Ohio University Board of Trustees. And so, and with also acknowledging that council will be going into recess in July. So we're trying to move these documents along in a timely fashion, but also with thorough consideration. On June 15th, we're going to be having a special session for the two other pieces of legislation that we will not have considered yet for first reading. So that will be the resolution that creates the community authority and the resolution to appoint the board. And then if those are adopted and signed on the morning of the 15th, we will then move into a public hearing. You might remember that the public hearing has been mentioned at various points. It wasn't until probably May 22nd that we actually said we have assigned the date. It is to be June 15th at 8 a.m. That notice has been published 3 times in the newspaper. It's also been featured in an Athens Messenger lead article about the Ridges discussion. And we'll continue to make those efforts to let the public know. So that's their opportunity. If they have concerns or comments that they want to make about the Ridges, we'd encourage folks to come. Or to offer written comment, they can do that also by submitting it to the clerk of council. After that public hearing on the 15th, that is when council would then reconvene in a special session to consider that legislation and moving it forward. And then That's about all that I wanted to present at this moment, and wanted to open this up now. We do have, Mr. Ritchie has joined us again tonight, and we thank you for taking the time to be here. And open it up for questions or comments. We'll first open it up to council members. Any questions about the documents you've looked at? Councilmember Crowell.
Thank you, President Isley. Mr. Ritchie, if you wouldn't mind, can you tell us what is amended here? I tried to look through it, and I see the version change at the bottom of each sheet, and at the very end, the summary, and it says 13 changes, but I'm not sure what those 13 changes are.
So it's a combination of correcting typos, adding additional information for clarity, like headings on the exhibits, notations, referring to the exhibits more explicitly in the preamble. So it's basically those things. They're mostly housekeeping or clarity issues. There's no substantive change proposed from the original.
Thank you.
Councilmember Swank.
We have all the information here, but the folks at home do not. Could you, in a Cliff Notes version, give our viewers a synopsis of the purchase agreement?
Yes. The proposed purchase agreement it's a long-term purchase agreement that it needs to be executed, or needs to be consummated or completed by 2029. So it's a fairly long-term, but it does permit us to include that portion of acreage in the new community authority, and permits us to expend money on infrastructure improvements. That's the first component of it. We carefully marked out the minimum of the park acreage that we would need, and so it's a fraction of the total, and most of the park would continue to be where it is as it is. So that's the second part of it. It contemplates payment, and the payment terms are either $200,000 at the option of the city, $200,000 for the acreage, or alternatively a 2-for-1 exchange of a restriction for active recreation elsewhere on the site, and the recreation of the miniature golf facility. So we didn't know what, and this is in the future, we don't know what direction that would be, but either the cash if you wanted to improve active recreation or somewhere else, or at the site itself. So those are the main features. It's a fairly long-term interest. It would be included in the new community authority. There is stated consideration for it, and it is an as-is, where-is sale, so there's no warranty being made as to the condition of the property. There is a specific provision. There is currently a restrictive covenant or restriction on the use if not used for recreation purposes. I think it reverts to Ohio University, so that there would be cooperation among the city, the university, and the developer to seek release of that. If it's not released, then the contract's null and void.
And you've been in Athens enough times to know how things circulate through the grapevine.
Yes, sir.
Under no circumstances are any city funds being expended. In other words, the city of Athens is not buying anything from Ohio University.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
That's correct.
Other questions or comments from council members? If not, we'll move on to administration. Any comments
None from us. Andy?
No, sir. No.
from our audience members? If not, okay.
Was that for the whole thing, or were you just doing the real
I'm
estate
just
purchase?
doing the real estate
Okay.
purchase now. We can move on now to the ordinance to create the new community authority. And it's titled resolution. We are, I think, still determining whether that's going to be a 3-reading ordinance.
It's permissible. It could be either a resolution or an ordinance. The resolution does not need the extra readings, and it was the recommendation of the attorney Caleb Bell that it be a resolution.
A resolution.
Yeah.
Ohio Revised Code does state resolution. However, it doesn't state how many readings for a resolution. We looked at the appropriations statute, and it talks about a resolution by council, and it specifically states a single reading. I think that if council is more comfortable, we'll do it as an ordinance, because that would be permissible also.
Yes.
we looked at Toledo, Ohio. They're a charter city, and they did it by way of an ordinance. But to understand that it would be, although a 3-reading ordinance, the rules would be suspended on Thursday and has an emergency clause. So I think we'll go ahead and, although it says resolution, it's very easy to change the title to an ordinance. It will have the same effect.
So the other documents that council that have been shared with council is the amended petition for the new community authority. And council members have probably seen, and once again, I think that primarily the changes made to that are, I think, housekeeping once again on this document. So council has seen this in an earlier version. You might note down on page 8 of that amended petition that rather than saying it was amended with the clerk of council, it inserts new language, petition was amended in accordance with revised code 349.03 to update this description of the boundaries of the proposed district. And then some other, I didn't note any other major changes that we're going through. So I don't know if council members have any questions about the amended petition. If not, yes, Mayor Patterson.
I do have a question for Mr. Ritchie. So with the new community authority, let's kind of vision out 20 years from now, and things are developed and everything's clicking. Does the composition of a board for the new community authority, does it migrate away from having Director Stone and the 3 other members, and I'm blanking on who they are because it's in the document, but would that ultimately then, though, become kind of almost like a, don't want to use the term HOA, but kind of an organization that is set up by those who actually reside there or have businesses in that?
Exactly. So in some ways, it is like an HOA in that the way it's structured, while there are bonds in place, the composition is as it's described, where there are 3 citizens representatives, there's a city representative, and the developer has representation. At the conclusion of that period, that is when the bonds are retired and the obligations have been met, then it would be a citizen vote, and it would be like an HOA, so that people living and working in the community would then be selected. So at some point in the future, the city would no longer be naming those citizen representatives, but in the meantime, the city has that role to help steward it forward.
And should there be any language in this ordinance just for historical memory, it doesn't get lost in time? And
so there is. So it does state that after the conclusion of the financing that is required, then it would be subject to the Ohio Revised Code calls for the election and the process for that. So it would convert to that, and all the trustees would agree to that process.
thank you.
Thank you.
So if there aren't any other questions or comments about that, that takes us to the 3rd document, which is that resolution to appoint the board for the community authority. That was initially presented on page 5 of the petition and is spelled out now in a separate resolution. So that would be appointing Dominic Brook, who is the Director of Real Estate. Is that correct? Director of Vice President, not sure which. Shauna Wolf, who is Vice President for Planning. Both of these persons have been heavily involved in the Ridges Advisory Committee and Shauna since its inception, and then myself as the initial citizen members. And then Service Safety Director Andrew Stone would be the representative of local government. And then the developer plans to appoint Mr. Ritchie, Laura Ritchie, who is Vice President. Vice President of the company.
Officer.
Okay, Chief Operating Officer. And Chastity Schmelzenbach, who is the Executive Director of Buckeye Hills Development Corporation. And Buckeye Hills, in fact, was the organization that Mr. Ritchie has been working with to do the initial study of the ridges that began, 24
Yes.
months ago?
So in fact, Buckeye Hills Regional Council, which is the Council of Governments, is a partner in the developer entity. So the Ridges Community Development is comprised of Community Building Partners, my company, and Buckeye Hills. So that's the stewardship model, and as you described it, thank you for introducing it in that way. All the parties involved as initial trustees have been very active in advancing the Ridges framework, identifying the details of it, engaging the engineers and market analysts in the process. So there's a lot of lifting that's required yet, especially in the early stages. So having a seasoned team working on it together that's interdisciplinary is important to the project. The evidence of collaboration between the university and the city is also very important. So all of this, the interweaving of these skills and capabilities is all very important to our progress.
Councilmember Swank?
One thing that I didn't see in this document is when this appointment would take effect. This is a very technical thing, but I'm assuming it would be January 1?
No, the appointment would take effect as soon as the new community authority is created, and then they have an initial meeting for the appointments. But we wanted to advance that because in discussions, so that all the parties knew very clearly what the intention was of as far as appointments.
The reason I said that, and again, this is a technicality, you would actually have 2 citizens members and 2 representatives of city government if it took effect immediately.
I think
President Nisley would be still a city official.
she is a city official, but she would fit into the citizen category. So it doesn't exempt or prohibit a city employee from being a member of the new community authority.
Okay.
Other questions? Okay. If not, then what we'll be doing tonight is moving through on the first ordinance for this, and that'll come under our first readings. All right, thank you, Mr. Ritchie.
Thank you very much.
Okay. We'll now have City and Safety Services Committee. That's chaired by Councilmember McCary and joined by Councilmembers Swank, Grace, and Crowell.
Thank you, President Nisley. We have 3 items on our City and Safety Services Committee agenda for tonight, beginning with the Stimson Avenue water line extension. And just to provide beginning to our discussion on this topic, this is legislation requesting to advertise, accept bids, and enter into contracts for construction and authorization and appropriate $200,000 for construction of the project. This is a water line on Stimson Avenue from Grant Street across to the roundabout. The water line will serve the new fire station building. That'll allow water service to be extended across the Stimson Avenue Bridge if the city expands in the future. And that's this project 364. I wonder if Director Stone has any additional information you'd like to share.
Thank you, Member McCary. This line is necessary for construction of the fire station, but it's not only for construction of the fire station. So what this will do is extend the main on Stimson Avenue that currently stops at Grant Street all the way to basically right before the bridge. When we go to do the bridge project in a couple of years, we will extend the main across the bridge. And so at some point in the future, should the city grow in that direction, up Rock Riffle Road, towards the large undeveloped parcels on the other side of the US 3350 interchange, we will have already taken the step to extend water service across the bridge. But this gets us in front of the new fire station, and so it'll allow us to make the tap for that and then proceed in the future to the east.
That does sound very necessary. I wonder if any members of council have questions. Councilmember Swank.
Can this project be completed without interfering with the roundabout? In other words, will it go north of the roundabout?
So there, thank you, Member Swank. There's a design now, and it takes completely out of the roadway of Stimson Avenue proper, so there shouldn't be any impact to the traveling public for construction of this.
Other committee members? Other members of council? Additional comments from administration or the public? That was a straightforward one. We'll move on to our Columbus Road lift station. And this is legislation requesting to enter into agreements for design of the project and to authorize and appropriate $175,000 to be used for the design and permitting for the Columbus Road Lift Station 1, which needs to be upgraded. The city will also be reviewing the connections between the existing lift stations along Columbus Road and has received $120,000 from the CDBG funds for construction of the replacement lift station to be used for equipment purchases. And this is part of a plan to apply for critical infrastructure funds in the future. Director Stone, do you have any additional information you'd like to share?
Thank you, Member Carey. Yes, on Columbus Road, there are 2 public and 1 private lift stations that need to be public. That private one needs to be public. It was an area where the city grew, and several entities ended up tapping into 1 lift station. This is out Theater Lane. Ultimately, this project will allow us to upgrade the lift station that currently exists on Door Lane. It's an older lift station that will increase the capacity and allow us to be able to move more. This will be important while we think it can handle the new hospital that's being built. Ultimately, that might get it close to its limit. But then also we'd like to look to the future and also just improve that station in general. Additionally, the private lift station that's on Theater Lane really should be public, and so this project also will seek to make a public lift station that's proper there on Theater Lane that'll allow any development on the undeveloped parcels on Theater Lane to go ahead and be built. And so that's really kind of the focus for this project. We do have that $120,000 of CDBG money allocated, and that's our allocation funds for 2 years worth of allocation funds to go towards the construction of this project. We've been advised by the folks in Columbus that administer the CDBG program that because we're using those allocation funds for this project, we'll be more competitive in a critical infrastructure grant, which is another CDBG program. And I think we can make a pretty strong case. We've used that funding model for a couple different projects in the past, most notably the Depot Street lift station, and so and we've also used it at the wastewater treatment plant. So it really is you can make a good case for use of that particular type of external funding if you utilize your and leverage your allocation funds through CDBG. So. I think this will be a good project, and we appreciate your consideration for getting the design done. Because like every external grant, or almost every external grant, the expectation is that the local entity funds the design and permitting of the effort.
Thank you, Director Stone. Questions from other committee members? Other members of council? Anything else from the administration?
I'd just like to share that, both this and the Stimson Avenue waterline extension is also, forward thinking, especially the private lift station that's kind of down near Theater Lane. So to build this out gives us greater capacity in the future if the city's going to grow in, only a couple different directions really based upon the comprehensive plan. And so this again is just forward thinking in terms of setting ourselves up for success in potential extension of the overall systems.
I agree. Good use of funding resources as well. President Isley?
I just have a question on the total cost of the project. Am I understanding that 125 of the 175 will be covered by CDBG, but we still have design costs?
No, I'm sorry, I probably wasn't particularly clear, President Isley. So that $120,000 we will put towards construction. So this $175 for design will be completely locally
This is
funded.
design only.
And then when we get into construction, I think we're going to be, well north of $1 million probably when it comes to this project. And so between, I think right now the minimum is $500,000 for a critical infrastructure grant, if you can get that, and then the 120, so that'll offset our construction costs. Right now we're paying with local funds for design.
I thought it was too good of a bargain.
Thank you for that clarification. Councilmember Crowell.
Just a quick clarification on locations we're talking about. Theater Lane, is that the old drive-in theater? That's the road that goes back to In-Town Body Shop, or?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions or comments on this topic from the audience? All right, then we'll move to our third and final City and Safety Services Committee meeting agenda item, the sewer system improvements, Phase 2. We've been working on sewer system improvements for some time. Recent discussions might conjure up Project 317, has the same funding source here, but let's see. This is requesting legislation to allow the advertisement and acceptance of bids for construction and construction engineering for Project 330. Richland Avenue Lift Station, there are three components here. The first being Richland Avenue Lift Station and gravity force main improvements. The second being State Route 56 lift station improvements with replacement of the existing State Route 56 lift station. And the third being the West Union Richland Avenue force main, installation of new force main between West Union to Richland Avenue, where the line will connect to the upgraded sewer line installed with the Richland project. So this project has a 0% regionalization loan from the Ohio EPA and was separated into parts to allow bidding and award the parts or sub-projects at separate times. I will invite Director Stone to add any additional information.
Sure, thank you, Member Carey. So, as the chair said, this is an extension of the regionalization loan that we secured because we struck the agreement to take sewage from the county. All of these projects are necessary to take their sewage, but not only to take their sewage. It's to allow the city to grow and basically to have build out of not only anything that would come from them, which is really relatively minimal, but also for the Ridges development that we've talked about, far out into the future, the build out of University Estates, the development of the Numberfest property, or what we refer to as the Numberfest property, and other portions of the city. At some point in the future, we anticipate that developing, and we need to have the infrastructure to be prepared to receive that sewage when it occurs. This financing is a very good arrangement for financing. So 0% for 30 years is not something that you get ever unless you're doing a regionalization, a sewer regionalization. So what we did basically, and we talked a little bit about this when we talked about Project 317, was we put a lot more things into this project than was the minimum necessary to receive the county sewage because we knew we were getting 0% for 30 years. So it's really a pretty good deal. Mr. Recchi talked earlier about the Ridges development, and that Project 317, which Member McCary described and talked about earlier, is the first part of this regionalization. It's just we've got it set up as a different project because it needed to go earlier, and that will allow for what we call the Tier 2 land, as well as the land along Dairy Lane, to have the necessary sewerage to be able to support development in the future. So this is something that we're excited about moving forward. The force main, which is that Part 3, that allows us to bypass the Depot Street lift station and not have to send more sewage through there and pay the electricity to pump it yet again, and instead go around and tie into the gravity sewer in the vicinity of Peden Stadium. The one other note on this is one of those weird EPA funded projects that require a resolution of tentative award. So after we bid these three parts, I will come back to you, maybe one at a time based on timing, and seek approval. And then at that point, the authorization and the appropriation necessary to that's based upon the bid. This is the only external funding source that's like this, where they don't allow you to basically apply for that funding until you have a bid in hand, and then they being the EPA, reviews the bid, and then you come back and you seek a one reading resolution for a resolution of tentative award, and we did that most recently with Project 317 specifically. So this is somewhat odd, and that's why we're not asking for any appropriations tonight, but only the authority to go out to bid.
Thank you. Great information. Questions from committee members? Other members of council? Other administrators? Audience members? Appreciate the city's efforts. That will conclude City and Safety Services for this evening.
Thank you, Councilmember McCary. We'll move on to Transportation Committee. That's chaired by Councilmember Reisner and joined by Councilmembers Grace, Ziff, and Swank.
Thank you, Madam President.
The others are not competitive.
Transportation Committee only has one item, OPWC Transportation Improvements, Issue 1 Funds. I'll turn it over to the administration. What do you need?
Thank you, Member Reisner. Every year, the City of Athens applies for State Issue 1 funds. There's a couple different ways you can apply. You can apply for loan, you can apply for a grant. Almost always, since I've been here, we've applied for a grant. I think only once we applied for loan funding. But in this particular case, it would be a $400,000 application. And while infrastructure, that is to say, utility infrastructure projects are allowed, they do not score very highly in the model that is set up by the Ohio Public Works Commission, and specifically our district of the Ohio Public Works Commission, to evaluate potential projects. So really, transportation projects are what score the highest. And so whether it be paving or a bridge project, in most cases, that's what does the best. And it has to do with volume of traffic, number of crashes, useful life of the infrastructure, and it's really kind of skewed towards transportation projects. So we don't have a specific project in mind. Every time we've applied, we've pretty much in the last 20 years we've been successful because we find what project that we want to do anyway that fits the criteria. And so, but a few years ago, they changed the rules to say that you had to have an ordinance to allow you to apply, and it always comes up right before council goes on recess because the application is due by September 1st, and rather than come back in August and ask you to start reading it and rush it, we thought we would bring it forward to allow us to apply right now.
Okay. Still probably means we'll have to suspend at some point. So, do we have time for 3 reads? No.
Yeah,
The 20th.
we'll do 1 and then 2 in August.
No, can't do August.
Tonight, the 20th and the 26th.
Okay.
We can do all 3.
Oh, we got a lot of meetings.
No kidding.
I have a question.
Question. Speak.
Mr. Stone, when you say projects, could it be used for equipment, like buses and things of that nature?
Thank you, Member Swank. No, this is very, very intentionally into capital improvements on the ground. That's a permanent fixture.
Okay. So if you have a bridge.
Right.
Yeah. Any questions from members of the committee? Other members of council? Questions about this? Member Solly.
Thank you. Okay, could you provide a little bit more clarity, at least for me, and regarding what kinds of transportation you're talking about now? If it's not, what equipment and this, that, and the other, a little bit more specificity, because as you know, I'm concerned about having a left and right turn lane off of, not to drum it into the ground, but how could I resist, Route 682, and just wondering if that could be a project.
Thank you, Member Spalding. Yes, so there's a rubric that is applied to projects that create a series of points basically, and then those points stack all the various asks in Southeast Ohio against one another, and so it's in your interest as a community to figure out the rubric, what things score the best. Repairs and rehabilitation score better than new construction. So if you have an existing bridge that you are replacing or redecking, that is scores way better than building a new bridge across a river where currently a bridge doesn't exist. Repaving scores better than building a new road somewhere where a road doesn't exist. Roads with more traffic score better than roads with less traffic if you're doing a transportation project. And so what you tend to do, or what our strategy has been in recent years, is we find some work we need to do anyway that scores well, submit it, get funded, and then that frees up local funding that you can use to do things that don't score as well. So historically, people have asked me, well, why don't you apply for sidewalks on this? Well, there's nowhere in that rubric that says sidewalks will compete well for these particular funds. These are funds that the state of Ohio gives to the Ohio Public Works Commissions through bond funding. That's why it's called State Issue 1, because it was an issue a long time ago to do bond funding, and then they do that every year. And so rather than submit a sidewalk project, which we know won't get funded, we will subsequently submit a paving project, which we know probably will get funded, and that'll free up $400,000 of local money that then we can use towards things that probably won't get funded. So to your particular request, my gut feel is that particular project wouldn't be very competitive because it's new construction, and basically it's widening of an existing and adding capacity to existing roadway. That said, that could free up money that then could be used for that if it's warranted, ultimately when we look at it.
Okay, thank you for that explanation.
Other questions? Members of the public? No? Okay, well, thank you very much. That concludes Transportation Committee.
Thank you, Councilmember Reisner. We'll now move on to Finance and Personnel, chaired by Councilmember Crowell and joined by Councilmembers Reisner, Ziff, and Spielness.
Excuse me. Thank you, President Isley. We have a number of appropriations on our agenda tonight. The first one is an appropriation of $44,500 to the street fund for the debt service line. And this is for the university estates assessment. We had a 10-year property tax assessment on the university estates streets. And the city has been paying about $46,000 per year to pay off this loan. But we're down to the final approximately $94,000, and the auditor thought it would be best to pay it off in full. We have about $50,000 available, so this would appropriate $44,500 in order to pay off that loan in full. Are there any questions from the committee members about this appropriation? Other members of council? City administration, anything to add? Public? Okay, thank you. The second item on our agenda is an appropriation of $22,000 to the Arts, Parks, and Recreation Income Tax Fund capital line for playground equipment. And from the Director of Arts, Parks, and Recreation, I have some notes here. They would like to replace slides at the community center playground, swings at the Richland Avenue Southside Park, a bridge on the playground at the community center, and they are installing 2 new pieces at the community center to replace a piece that was broken and removed last year. These 2 new pieces are whirly chairs. One has a harness for accessibility. So this is an appropriation of $22,000 for the playgrounds. Any questions from the committee? Well, other members of council? City administration, anything to add? Public? Thank you. Next item on our agenda is an appropriation of $50,000 to the sewer fund for the installation of a building, the construction of a building to house the vac truck. And the information that I have on this is that the funds were actually allocated last year in 2022 and encumbered, but a vendor to do this was not found. So those funds will be unencumbered, and the city administration is requesting this $50,000 for the installation of this building this year. Is there anything to add, Director Stone?
You zeroed in on it, Member Crowell, but we attempted to do this in 2022. We couldn't commit the funds in 2022, and so because we couldn't find a vendor willing to do it, we have one now, but because we didn't commit them in 2022, unfortunately, just because of auditing rules, it has to go back into the unappropriated balance, and then we're asking to have it appropriated again so they can encumber 2023 funds to do it.
And Director Stone, the vac truck, does the truck that sort of clears out Is it for our leaves and street sweeping, or is it for clearing out like sewer?
It's specifically for sewers, and, you know, you can also do hydro excavation with it, which is basically a gigantic vacuum cleaner that sprays water into a hole and makes the dirt into a slurry and then sucks it out, as opposed to digging with a backhoe. It's an extremely useful piece of equipment that's necessary for keeping sewers clean. And while we do have a building that it kind of fits in, it doesn't really very well, and so this is a needed piece of improvement on the site down there at 30 Curran.
Thank you. Questions from the committee on the vac truck building? Other members of council? Anything to add? Members of the public? Okay, thank you. The next item, the next two items are pertaining to the same basic situation. $20,000 to the storm sewer fund for backfill material. And then the next item is $50,000 for repairing a storm tunnel near Meadow Lane on the east side. Not only have we discovered that the storm tunnel really needs to be repaired, it also needs material from the city, which is that additional $50,000. The contractor has a quote of $50,000 for the repair, so this in total with the two is $70,000. Any questions from the committee on this repair? Other members of council? Anything to add? Okay, members of the public? Okay, thank you very much. That ends appropriations. The last item we have on our agenda tonight is staffing. And we have a relatively minor change in our staffing ordinance for officers or positions at the police department. There are currently 2 auxiliary communication officers in the staffing ordinance. These positions aren't really used anymore. Patrol officers are used to work this communications dispatch when other dispatchers are not available. And this actually, the city administration believes works pretty well, and that it allows patrol officers to see sort of the other side of the communications or of operations when they're on the street and having to call back in. And so instead of having these in the staffing ordinance auxiliary communications positions, they would like to change this to 2 non-sworn auxiliary positions. Director Stone, do I have that? Anything else you want to add to that?
I can add, explain specifically what I mean by non-sworn. Most of our reserve officers are either officers who serve in another agency and just hold a commission with us, or are retired from the city of Athens. And so these are people that we can call upon to grow the force basically in a part-time capacity when needed. Those retired officers, in order to continue to do that work, have to maintain their OPATA certification. So basically, to continue to be allowed to, carry a badge and gun and do misdemeanor arrests in the state of Ohio, and the other duties that only law enforcement officers with those credentials are allowed to do, they have to maintain that certification. There is a desire occasionally from some of those retired members to not maintain that certification any longer. Their CEUs required. It's just they just are tired of being on the street and chasing bad guys, and would rather not maintain that APATA certification. However, there's still use for them in a part-time capacity. The one in particular that comes to mind that we're really seeking for this is a reserve officer we currently have that assists a couple hours a week in our evidence room right now. And because he was a detective for a very long time, he really understands the management of the evidence room and the rules associated, but he just doesn't want to maintain that APATA certification. So what we're doing is we're asking for you to eliminate those 2 auxiliary communication officer positions, which we never use, and instead do 2 non-sworn auxiliary police officers.
Great, thank you. Any questions from the committee? Other members of council? Members of the public? Thank you, President Isley. That ends Finance and Personnel.
Thank you, Councilmember Crowe. Give just a moment for folks to come back up to the dais, and we'll start the special session. All right, we'll begin with ordinances for third reading. 5223 is, oh, and we need to establish the quorum first. All members of council are present. It's a technicality, but we need to follow it. Okay. Ordinance 5223 is an ordinance authorizing the 2023 street paving and repairs project number 363. It is introduced by Councilmember Reisner.
Thank you, Madam President. We discussed this in committee, and it's been read. Essentially, this is our annual street rehabilitation and paving ordinance, and just to shake your memory a little bit, we're essentially authorizing $700,000 for paving and repairs. So I'd like to make a motion that we adopt 52-23.
Second?
We have a motion and second. Do we have any comments or questions from council members, administration, other elected officials, or the audience? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The motion carries and the ordinance is approved. Ordinance 5323 is an ordinance amending the 2023 appropriation ordinance 15522. It is introduced by Councilmember Crowe.
Thank you, President Isley. I'd like to make a motion to approve 5323.
Second.
Thank you, Member Reisner. This is to amend the appropriation ordinance by appropriating from the unappropriated balance $27,603 from a Bureau of Workers' Compensation refund check. Thank you, President Isley.
We have a motion and second. Any comments or questions from council, administration, other elected officials, or our audience? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion carries and the ordinance is approved. 5423 is an ordinance to increase the fire chief's compensation and declaring an emergency. It is introduced by Councilmember Crowe.
Thank you, President Isley. We discussed this at committee and at first reading. I'm going to go ahead and read this into the record. Section 1, effective July 5th, 2023, Athens City Council does hereby authorize increasing the annual rate of the fire chief from $98,500 to $102,980.80. And that should do it. And I make a motion that we approve 5423.
Second. We have a motion and second. Any questions or comments? Council members, administration, other elected officials, or our audience? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The motion carries and the ordinance is approved. 5523 is an ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to advertise, accept bids, and enter into a contract for municipal refuse, recycling, and optional composting and declaring an emergency, and is introduced by Councilmember McCary.
Thank you, President Isley. This has been discussed previously as a effort to restore authority in decision-making to our Service Safety Director to advertise, accept bids, and enter into contract for municipal refuse recycling and optional composting and declaring an emergency. Section 1 indicates that the Service Safety Director would be authorized to advertise and accept bids and enter into a written contract for municipal refuse recycling and optional composting effective January 1st, 2024 through June 30th, 2027, with the lowest and best bidder as advertised pursuant to Ohio Revised Code 735.05 in an amount not to exceed $2,600,000 annually. Section 2 indicates the Service Safety Director is hereby authorized to expend up to $2,600,000 annually from Garbage Fund 760-636, Transaction Code 300 for said purpose. And Section 3, it may be necessary for Athens City Council to amend Athens City Code Title 1, Chapter 1.03 codes fees established to adjust monthly rates to accommodate the terms of the contract. Finally, Section 4, this ordinance shall be an emergency measure necessary for the preservation of health, welfare, and safety for the residents of the city of Athens, Ohio, in order to continue to provide for the efficient delivery of services, and it shall be in full force and effect upon passage by an approval by the mayor. I would recommend that we pursue this on an emergency basis.
Making a motion.
Yes.
Okay.
I move that we adopt ordinance 5523.
Second.
Any comments or questions? Councilmember Swank?
$2.1 million. $2.1 million. This ordinance would cost the citizens $2.1 million more than we know we can get this service for. But how much is $2.1 million? Let's say that you spent $1,000 a day. $1,000 a day. Would anyone hazard a guess as to how many days it would take to spend $2.1 million? 5.7 years. 5.7 years. $1,000 a day, $30,000 a month. If we were talking about personal finances, household finances, I doubt if there's anyone in this room whose household finances or household budget is $30,000 a month. In fact, unless you have a kid or two in college, I would doubt if there's anybody in this room that has a personal budget of $15,000 a month. Yet the citizens of Athens are being asked to spend, over the next 3.5 years, $2.1 million more than we know we can get these services for. We're talking about money, plain and simple. Ironically, I received an email from a Near East Side resident today, and it had a link to the Record Courier newspaper in the town of Ravenna. It's in Portage County, just east of Kent, 15 miles east of Akron. The city of Kent is switching from the Portage County Solid Waste Management District to its current trash hauler, Republic Services, for recycling services. The move, effective July 1, initially will save Kent residents $30 a year. Portage County charges residential customers $5.50 per month for recycling, compared to Republic's bid of $3 per month for the first year. According to at-large Kent Councilman Roger Sidoti, after that, the base cost will rise incrementally, capping off at $3.65 in the 5th year. Sticking with Portage County recycling would have cost residents more, quote, a regressive tax, if you want to call it that, right out of the pocketbooks of our citizens, end quote, Sidoti said. That's essentially what we're doing here. You know, this fall, the League of Women Voters isn't going to be very busy. And the reason they're not going to be very busy is we don't have any contested elections in the city of Athens except for one. But if we did, a question I'm sure that would be asked at one of those League of Women Voters forums is this: how could you have voted for an ordinance that's costing the citizens of Athens $2.1 million? I couldn't give an explanation if I was asked that question. And that's why I am going to vote no on this ordinance tonight, and would hope that my fellow council members would consider the same. Thank you, President Isley.
Any other comments or questions? Councilmember Spielness?
I guess I need some clarification here, because the dollar amount is really up to rather than saying, we're going to spend that much, it could be as much as if needed. So to me, the pertinent part of this is really that the Service Safety Director will justifiably so, then have the responsibility of accepting bids and entering into a contract rather than having City Council do it. So unless the Law Director advises me otherwise, we are not authorizing that amount. We're authorizing that the City Safety Director will pick the best and lowest bid.
Any other questions or comments? Councilmember McCary?
Thank you, and thank you, Councilmember Spielnez. That matches my understanding, and I do appreciate the thoughtful conversations council has had, trying to review the history on why we wanted to provide clarification on decision-making authority in this matter. And since we do have our City Safety Services Director here with the experience of having observed many of these kinds of contracts, I would just invite some comments on the benefits of providing you with the flexibility up to this dollar amount, or any other comments you have.
Thank you, Member McCary. When you do construction projects, you have a design professional, whether that be a design professional that works for the city, one of our professional engineers, or one that works for a consultant that provides an engineer's estimate or an architect's estimate for that construction. And they basically do an assessment of the construction industry right before we get ready to bid, and then usually that's the number that we use when we seek authorization to spend up to that amount. This is a services contract, so it's a little bit more. There's not that doesn't exist. You basically look at the market and you try to kind of figure out the work, and you look at past bids, and you try to figure out what potentially you would need, and so that's the number that we used. I don't want to have to come back and ask you for more money, so I'd rather ask for an authorization that's higher than what we intend to spend, rather than ask for an authorization that's lower and then have to come back and talk about this again. So that's the reason for that number.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Councilmember Swank?
I actually used that analogy a couple meetings ago. And the analogy I used to refresh everyone's memory was we had estimates from two design professionals. One estimate was $1.93 million. The other was $2.5 million. We had two companies tell us they could do it for X and Y. And my sole point is this: we know we can get it for $1.93 million. I suggested rather than $2.6 million as the amount, to make it $2 million. With a 10% override, we could have gone as high as $2,200,000. There's nothing in here that leads me to believe that we still won't get a bid in the neighborhood of $1.9 to $2 million. Inflation's on its way down. Gas prices are on their way down. Labor payment for wages has stabilized. Now, what I'm hoping, because I have an idea that council will vote 6-1 on this, is that even though you have the 2.6 million cap, that we'll get a bid in the neighborhood of 1.9 or 2 million, and it will be deemed lowest and best. So that's how I came up with that $2.1 million. Potentially, it could be. But only because we as a council vote to allow that possibility to happen.
Okay. Any other comments or questions from council, administration, or our audience members or other elected officials? Okay. We have a motion and second for approval of 5523. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
Nay.
Okay, we have a 6-1 vote on this, and the motion carries and the ordinance is approved. 5623 is an ordinance granting a special right-of-way use permit at 447 East State Street. The Aaron Thomas, owner, changed the face of an existing freestanding sign of a city on the city right-of-way, and is introduced by Councilmember Grace.
Thank you, President Nisley. I'd like to make a motion that we adopt ordinance 5623.
Second.
Thank you, Member Ziff. And this ordinance does exactly what the title states. It grants that property owner the permission to place a sign, or in this case, to change the face of an existing sign on the city's right-of-way. And this sign is at 447 East State Street. And the Section 3 states that the permit shall be subject to the following conditions. One is that the special right-of-way permit is personal in nature and will be in effect for a maximum of 7 years from the date of issuance, unless revoked by city council ordinance, or there is a change of ownership or use, whichever comes first. And 2, that Aaron Thomas, the owner, shall be responsible for maintenance and upkeep of said right-of-way.
We have a motion and second for approval of 5623. Do we have any other comments or questions? Council members, administration, other elected officials, or the audience? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion carries and the ordinance is approved. We now have a series of ordinances for second reading. I will read through those. If there are updates, comments, or questions, persons can just raise their hand and I will recognize them. If not, then we'll move on to the next one. 5723 is an ordinance granting a special right-of-way use permit at 1 South Court Street to the Athens County Board of Commissioners for placement of an election ballot box on the city right-of-way, and is introduced by Councilmember Grace. Questions or comments? 5823, an ordinance granting a special right-of-way use permit at 286 West Union Street to the Athens County Agricultural Society to place a fence on the city right-of-way. And that is introduced by Councilmember Grace. And Councilmember Spielness, yes.
Okay. As you all know, the neighbors directly across from where this would be and on Harold Avenue are not happy about this, and I requested that the city administration negotiate with the Fair Board to talk about some modifications of the fence so it's not so offensive and hurts property values. I understand that that was tasked to David Riggs. It's my understanding that they have not had a conversation yet. I think that's material to this issue. I'm also concerned about the, I guess we call it contingency regarding what can be sold at the fair, and I wanted to check with Law Director about that, and I'm going to defer to you on that comment.
But, well, let's answer.
We'll let
Councilmember
Member Grace,
Okay,
perhaps
yes,
she
go
has
ahead.
some other information.
I believe that Director Riggs did have a conversation with Ben Upfall, the treasurer of the Agricultural Society, today. Mr. Upfall was out of town last week, and so was not, the conversation was not able to happen until today, but I believe they spoke today, and Director Riggs shared some of the concerns that have been raised here, and also shared some information pertaining to modifications to the fence for the fair, the Agricultural Society, and Mr. Upfall to consider. And I don't know, I don't believe there was a definite response to that, but Director Riggs did share some pricing and information for some modifications to the fence style. And so that has been happening, but I don't know that we have a lot of specifics to incorporate at this point in time. We have not received an amended application or changes to the application, but there is a conversation happening.
Okay.
And can we get Law Director Eliason's comments first, then about the question about the contingency phrase?
Well, I did research the issue, and I did find a Supreme Court case that was on point as far as an agricultural society, which is its own political subdivision. And their request for a fence is more of a governmental function rather than proprietary. And if it was proprietary, it would be something like that they could conduct their stock sale there. But this would be a function that any other private citizen would have to comply with the city ordinance as far as the setback. And I have not had a conversation with Director Riggs about that. My conversation with him was the size of the fence, and there's no control as far as the product used for the fence if it's 6 feet or under. And apparently this was going to be under 6 feet. So as far as that goes, I would hope there would be some future discussion between Director Riggs and Mr. Abfall regarding the actual fence. Because I do think that setback would apply, meaning that this fence couldn't be right at the street level. It would have to comply with our city ordinances regarding requiring a setback. And as to the other issue, the contingency, I certainly understand the mayor's concern, and that would be my concern also. However, I think that there might be legal issue as far as making it contingent, the fence contingent, or that section contingent upon the restriction that we were going to place that's in the ordinance. If there were a similar restriction citywide, that would definitely be illegal. I could think of all sorts of problems with that. Speech, maybe unlawful restraint of trade. The pet land case came to mind when we restricted, that was years ago, the city through ordinance restricted pet land from purchasing animals that weren't from breeders in the city. So we faced a legal challenge from Pet Land, which is a very large corporation with a lot of financial resources, and in the end, the city repealed that ordinance. So I do have some concerns. But I also understand where the mayor's coming from as far as the offensive nature of some of the things that are sold there.
Just going back to the first issue you raised in terms of setback. Director Stone and I were speaking just briefly before this meeting about that, and I believe that along Herald, it's that zone does not include a setback from the street, so they could place their fence at the edge of the city's right-of-way, but there is no additional setback from Herald Avenue because of the business zone there.
Other comments? Councilmember Swank and then Councilmember Spielness.
Since last Monday night, I've had multiple conversations with Mr. Day, Matt Day, the president of the Agriculture Society. And Section 3 is a non-starter. As long as it's in the ordinance, they won't sign this, period. And the reason they will not sign it is because the Agriculture Society had a vote several years ago, and the vote was overwhelmingly in favor to allow this practice to continue. Or maybe I should say another way, not to ban this practice. And this past Tuesday night, the Agriculture Society had a meeting. They had a motion on the floor in a second to go ahead, and basically the heck with the city. And Mr. Day did an outstanding job of being able to talk people off the cliff and to withdraw that, and it did not happen. But as of this morning, if that section is in there, it's a dead deal. My suggestion would be to amend this and get rid of it, and let's move forward. Primarily based on what I just heard from the law director, that this is probably going to be another pet land issue if we put it in there. But even if we do put it in here, they're not going to sign it. They can still put up their fence. They just can't put it across the right-of-way. And during that 2 weeks of the fair, they can simply patrol that and monitor traffic, and I don't mean car traffic, but foot traffic in and out. As the law director said, and this doesn't make me happy. I'm not advocating flying Confederate flags and selling this merchandise and all of that. And neither is the Fair Board. As we talked about last week, they actually asked vendors to get it out of sight. And the vendors did. But whether we pass this or not, they can do whatever they want because it's their property. They're trying to be good neighbors. They're willing to put in an attractive fence, to landscape it, to minimize the negative effects of the residents there. And I think the easiest way to deal with this, until the Agricultural Society takes a different vote, and if you really want to change this, here's how you change it. Everybody in this room who feels Section 3 should be in there, and all of your friends paid $35 and joined the Agricultural Society, and when the next vote comes up in November, make that vote. It's that simple. But for now, I think we just need to take Section 3 out, work with the Agricultural Society, get the most attractive fence up if we can, get the landscaping up, and move on. Now, to do that, what would that require? A motion to amend?
It would, but I want to see what Councilmember Spielness has to say first.
Yes, with these issues in mind, I hate to do this again, but I would like to make a motion to table this for a week so that negotiations can happen, and that further consideration of options could be considered, and so that the city administration, the Fair Board leadership have the opportunity to resolve the language and then come forward with something.
So you're making a motion
Yes.
to table?
Second.
Got a motion to table, and you were fairly specific. You'd like to do that for a week to see where that could go. Any other debate or
Just a
questions or comments? Yes,
question
Councilmember
of
Swain.
order. If we do that, and I think it's probably a pretty good idea, would this come back when we remove it from the table? Does it come back at second reading or third reading?
We come back at second.
So you'd still have time if you wanted to pass it before the end of June.
So we have next, I'm just trying, in my mind, 19th. Oh, we don't meet next Monday.
We meet on Tuesday,
So that would be the second reading,
correct?
and then we don't have any more regular scheduled meetings.
We could have a special session on the 26th.
Okay. Okay. So it comes back as second reading. That's the answer. Okay, great.
Do I have a motion and second on the table? Any other questions, comments, or debate? Or, yes, Councilmember Grace, and then Service Safety Director Stone.
Just for clarity, if, when it is brought back off the table, it is amended, then it's read for the first
time
time.
around and goes to first reading, in which case you would need to suspend to pass it in time. And after next Monday, the 15th is the last date we have 6 members here to be able to suspend. So the other option would be to amend now to remove that. So good point. Procedurally, you hamstring yourself by leaving that amendment in there right now. But I'd like to get Service Safety Director Stone's comments.
Sure, thank you, President Isley. Just a couple points of clarification on the discussion that's occurred so far. So Director Riggs did speak with the Secretary of the Fair Board, or I'm sorry, the Treasurer of the Fair Board, Ben Apfel, today. Ben Apfel is the applicant, representing the Fair Board for the permit. There is not another signature that occurs from the Fair Board at this point. The signature occurred on the application, so it's not like you pass something and then they have to sign an agreement. So the agreement has been what they applied for. Now you might not pass what they asked for, or put as a restriction on what they asked for, but they don't have to countersign to come back. So that's just a clarification and procedure for that permit process for a special right-of-way permit. Secondly, it is correct that there is no front yard setback in a B3. The right-of-way line is quite a few feet off of the existing pavement. So it won't be right up on the road. The applicant indicated that they would have a surveyor establish that line prior to building a fence so they didn't accidentally build in the right of way. Thirdly, Mr. Apfel did indicate to Mr. Riggs that they were unwilling to build a wood fence. They intended to build a chain link fence. We did recommend they consider screening material that would be placed in the fence, similar to what is on the spoil material fence that is beside the wastewater treatment plant. So if you're familiar on the wastewater treatment plant, across the bike path from it, there's an area that we put material left over from water breaks, and the dewatering station is there, and a couple other things. And there's some screening material that's placed inside the chain link. And so we've recommended to them. They said they would consider it. We've not heard anything else back from them. That went later this afternoon. And then the last point is we did ask for Mr. Apfel to come to City Council to speak to their position, and again, didn't hear back from them. So that's just clarifying all the various points of discussion on the topic.
So we have the motion and second to lay this on the table for 1 week. The difficulty being, if you choose to keep it as is, you will not have the flexibility to be able to amend it in time to pass by suspending the rules by June 30. Councilmember Crowell.
Thank you, President Isley. I just, a little more clarification. If we amend and we remove section 3, nothing else in this ordinance ensures that any kind of landscaping or anything happens, even the shading or whatever you called that, it may just still be a chain link fence. I just want to make sure we all understand that there's nothing in this that says anything about what kind of fence that they can build. We've talked to them, we've asked them, and it's up to them, I believe. Just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Councilmember Spielness.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that the Fair Board would want to be good neighbors. So making it a little bit more attractive, perhaps putting bushes up or whatever kind of screening to make it, if they're going to do a chain link fence or something that hideous, at least they could do something to mask it and make it a little bit more favorable for the neighbors.
So what do we have as choice of counsel? One possibility would be could that be done by friendly amendment to withdraw the motion to lay on the table? Because we haven't taken a vote yet.
Okay.
That's a possibility, and then you can amend to remove the contingency clause.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Given all the discussion that's happened, I think perhaps it makes more sense to remove the contingency clause, because my guess is that they're more, from my constituents' perspective, they're probably more likely to be willing to negotiate or discuss anyway the fence situation if that was off the table this go around. So I will remove my motion, and we can talk about an amendment if that's okay.
Okay. And can we have a removal of the second? Yep. Thank you, Ben. Councilmember Ziff.
Bob Ziff.
Okay, so that's now, the motion to lay on the table has been removed. And are you then making a motion to amend, Councilmember Spielness?
Yes,
And
please.
this would be, I need to find it is section 3. So it would be, a motion to amend is to remove section 3 from the
Yes.
ordinance. Okay,
Yes.
do we have a motion for that, and do we have a second?
I'll second.
Councilmember McCary seconds. And do we have any further discussion or comments? Mayor Patterson, as this was
You know,
addressed.
we have been working actually, since Councilmember Grace put forward the resolution declaring racism as a public health emergency. We tout that we're an inclusive community. We tout that we are protecting all who live in our community. And I'm literally shocked that removing that language would be considered and allowing for the continuance of selling paraphernalia that is part of the systems of racism. It is. Anything that is seditious in nature, anything that supports hate, you are, by removing that, regardless of what the consequences might be, you are becoming and remaining part of the system that is racism.
comments? Councilmember Swank and Spelness.
I take offense to that. Because what you're advocating is throwing out a legitimate vote. Overturning an election. Yes. The Agricultural Society voted by a vote of over 2-1 on an issue. The Fair Board does not have the jurisdiction to overturn that vote. We're not talking about racism here. We're talking about a vote, which a board who has applied for this permit does not have the authority to overturn. I described in very great detail how we can address this issue. Pay the $35, show up in November with all of our friends, and we can vote to no longer allow the sale of the type of material that offends both you and me. It's as simple as that.
Councilmember Spelness.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the mayor's concern, and I appreciate where he's coming from, and I certainly don't approve of that stuff either. But I think that some of the potential legal problems with continuing with this, I think are worthy of note, and I'm hoping that perhaps we can use methods that are persuasive over time. I'm afraid that being antagonistic in this kind of way may not be effective. So it's kind of like you take a spoonful of sugar with the medicine. You know, you try to find ways to, gently twist arms. And I know efforts have been made, but I just am not convinced that this is the best strategy. So that's my pitch.
Councilmember McCary.
Thank you. I'll be brief, as many of the points that I would have shared have just been shared, including the desire to see the council and the city continue to work with the Fair Board on ways to promote the kinds of inclusion that the mayor is speaking of. I hope that we can think about this in the context of a resolution recommitting ourselves to racial equity that we'll be working on, and thinking about how we can also take into consideration the national and state climate that we're in, and I appreciate the law director's input on that regard.
Okay.
President Nyes.
Yes. Councilmember Grace.
I also will be brief, and I will say that there are many residents of the city of Athens who attempted for quite some time through mailing of cards and letters and going to meetings, attending, being a part of the conversation with the Agricultural Society to even bring this vote forward some years ago. And it was a very genuine, open, like they weren't rude or forceful or demanding or coercive in their request, and it was flat out denied. The city has in past tried to exert some influence and work with them and ask also from the perspective of the city that they adopt this change. And I think that sometimes there are issues that are worth fighting in court. There are things that are worth making, if it comes down to it, a very public and official stand on. And I think that this is one of those issues. And in terms of our hopes that they wish to be good neighbors, and our belief that perhaps they do, and they would want to place a more decorative fence, or that they want to work with the city. I don't believe that we have historical reference to support that. I don't think that the history supports that. either in terms of the sale of seditious material or in terms of the beautification of their fence. And so when it comes down to it, and the idea that, well, if we remove this, maybe they'll be more open to putting up a prettier fence or doing landscaping. One, I don't think it's worth it. And two, I'm not sure how far we'd get with it, but more importantly, I don't think it's worth it. I don't think that removing that language just to placate and make them more amenable to a different style of fence is worth what we are giving up in the statement that we would be making. So I would be voting against the amendment on the principle that I think this is, because of the composition, the city doesn't have a whole lot of leverage with this entity. And this is one thing that we have that we can say, no, this is important to us as a city, to the residents of the city. We don't have a whole lot of control about what they do on their property, but we can say, if you want to use city property, we're putting some conditions on it because this is something we believe in. That's my.
Councilmember Crowell?
Thank you, President Isley. Thank you, Member Grace. I couldn't have said it better myself. I don't know what the end result of this fence will be. I also feel like that we are trying to get a nice fence for something that's really meaningful in terms of what we're asking for in this ordinance. The Ohio State Fair has banned the sale of Confederate merchandise at their fair. I'm not sure. I mean, I was a regular fair goer as a kid. I really enjoyed the Athens County Fair. I was there recently working with the move-out process with Ohio University and worked with a lot of members of the fair board, and I was really happy that they do that service for the community. I really appreciated the hard work that they put in and the space that they allow the university to use to get those goods to people who need them. I had nothing but a positive experience with everybody I worked there. I don't know what it is about the vote of the entire agricultural society and why it runs counter to what I think are the values that the city of Athens holds very deeply. But I will also not be voting for this amendment. Thank you.
Any other comments? Councilmember McCary?
Thank you. I know this discussion has gone long, but I do want to have as much scope regarding the concerns for litigation as possible. And I know that our law director already provided us with the example of Petland, but just based on the few different angles that you identified, what would the worst case scenario in a situation like this be?
That we would end up repealing the ordinance. I don't know if there would be a financial aspect to it. Would probably be more of a lawsuit to compel a mandamus, maybe a mandamus action to compel an official to issue the permit.
Thank you. With that clarification, I would like to withdraw my second for the amendment.
So we have a motion to amend. Do we have a second? If we don't, then the motion to amend dies. Okay. So what we have now is, having read it for the second time. There we go. And good discussion. Thank you very much. Okay.
Indeed.
We'll now move on to Ordinance 5923. This is an ordinance amending Ordinance 3323, granting a special right-of-way use permit at 758 West Union Street to Seven Generations LLC owner to add a fence and equipment parking, and is introduced by Councilmember Grace. If no comments, questions, then we will move on to our next ordinance. And that's 6023. This is an ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to execute an expanded permanent easement and right-of-way agreement with the Ohio Power Company, AEP, for installation of overhead electrical service at 21 Kenny Drive, and is introduced by Councilmember Grace. No comments or questions. We'll move on to the next, 6223. This is an ordinance authorizing preliminary engineering services for the State Route 682-56 intersection improvements, which is project number 357, and introduced by Councilmember Reisner. If no comments or questions, the next ordinance is 6323. This is an ordinance authorizing engineering services for rehabilitation of the Stimson Avenue Bridge, which is project 358, introduced by Councilmember Reisner. And if no comments or questions on this one, our next ordinance is 6423, an ordinance amending Ordinance 4422, Athens City Code Title I, General Provisions, Chapter 1.03, Code Fees Established, Solid Waste, Recycling, and Optional Composting Rates. And this is introduced by all members of council. If no comments or questions, we'll now move on to Ordinance 6523. This is an ordinance amending the 2023 Appropriation Ordinance 15522 and is introduced by Councilmember Crowell. No comments or questions, then the next ordinance is Ordinance 6623, an ordinance amending Ordinance 12220, authorizing construction and construction engineering of the dewatering facilities at the wastewater treatment plant. This is project number 320, and declaring an emergency, and is introduced by Councilmember McCary. Now, does that need suspending?
Thank you, President Isley. We do need to declare an emergency for 6623, and I would like to move that we suspend the rules to do so.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and second for suspending the rules. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The rules have been suspended, Councilmember Carey.
Thank you.
And now a motion to approve.
I would like to make a motion that we adopt 6623.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and second. Do we have any comments or questions? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The motion carries and the ordinance is approved. Ordinance 6723 is an ordinance declaring a real and present emergency, thus obviating the formal bidding procedure for residential and franchise area refuse and recycling collection services, and is introduced by Councilmember McCary.
Thank you, President Isley. Once again, I would move that we suspend the rules to adopt Ordinance 6723.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and second for suspending the rules. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
Nay.
Okay, we have a 6-1 vote on that. The rules have been suspended. Motion, Councilmember McCary.
Thank you. I move that we adopt Ordinance 6723.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and second. Do we have any comments or questions before taking the vote? All those in favor signify by saying, oh, I'm sorry.
Do you want to ask if there's any comment
I did. Just now. Any comments or questions
from?
from council members, administration, audience, or other elected officials? Yes, Councilmember Swank.
Has any thought been given to trying to negotiate an amount similar to the rate of inflation?
I will, with President Isley's permission, offer a comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
It is my understanding from the presentations that we've received that the bids will reflect inflation, and that the Service Safety Director has taken that into consideration in determining what a maximum amount would be.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments or questions? Okay, then we'll have the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
Nay.
We have a 6-1 vote. Final and motion passes and the ordinance is approved. 6823 is an ordinance, amending ordinance 13322. This is to authorize the Service Safety Director to accept bids where necessary and enter into contract for replacement of the community center roof, project number 353, introduced by Councilmember Crowell. And do we have any comments, questions from council members, administration, other elected officials, or the audience?
I had a note about suspending the rules on this from either last week or at some point. Do they need to be suspended?
This is the additional costs of the community center roof.
Shifting money from one to the other. Is that something that needs?
This is the or President Isley, I'll speak into this. This is the, shifting the funding source from 271 to 273, and I believe it had to do with there not being enough money in that 272. Yeah, because that's the end of that particular fund, and so we basically reduced that amount because it actually wasn't there, and we just did it out of 273. Does that sound right? Okay. Yeah, I don't know that there's a need to suspend on this one.
Okay. But thank you. Thanks for asking. Okay. We'll move on to ordinance 6923. This is an ordinance approving a then and now certificate for payment to Dam Schroeder Roofing and for replacement of the community center roof, which is project number 353, and declaring an emergency. Introduced by Councilmember Crowell. And I believe we're okay because we'll pass this within 30 days. Okay. Thank you. Any other comments or questions from council members, administration, other elected officials, or our audience? We'll now move on to ordinances for first reading. 7023 is an ordinance authorizing a purchase agreement with the Ridges Community Development LLC or its nominee, the Ridges New Community Authority, and declaring an emergency. This is introduced by all members of council. And by way of background information, those of us who have been with the meeting earlier this evening heard the presentation from Mr. Joe Ritchie and some background information that we provided. This is the purchase agreement for several acres of land that is currently owned by the city that long-term would be used for some of the infrastructure improvements and development for the Ridges. And if council members would consider making a motion and second, no motion and second, it's just the first reading, excuse me. But we'll be there by June 30, we hope. It's getting late. Okay, thank you. 7123 is an ordinance authorizing construction and construction engineering of the Stimson Avenue Waterline Extension Project number 364, introduced by Councilmember McCary.
Thank you, President Isley. This was just discussed in committee earlier this evening, and I will read for the record, whereas said extension will provide water service to the new fire station and any future expansion to the east across the Stimson Avenue Bridge. Section 1 indicates that the Service Safety Director is hereby authorized to advertise and accept bids where necessary and to enter into contracts with the lowest and best bidder for construction and construction engineering of the Stimson Avenue Waterline Extension Project 364. Section 2 reads, the 2023 Appropriation Ordinance 155-22 is hereby amended by appropriating from the unappropriated balance the sum of $200,000 to Water Fund 740.635, Transaction Code 500, and increasing the total appropriations by said amount. Section 3 indicates that the Service Safety Director is further authorized to expend up to $200,000 from Water Fund 740.635 for said project, and this ordinance shall be in effect and full force upon its passage and approval by the mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember McCary. All right. The next ordinance is 7223. This is an ordinance authorizing engineering services for design of the Columbus Road Lift Station, project number 359, introduced by Councilmember McCary.
Thank you, President Isley. I'll read for the record, beginning with, whereas the city has received $120,000 in community development block grant funds for construction of this project and plans to apply for $500,000 in critical infrastructure funds, be it ordained by the Council of the City of Athens, Ohio, the Service Safety Director is hereby authorized to enter into contract for engineering services for design of the Columbus Road Lift Station, Project 359. Section 2 reads that the 2023 Appropriation Ordinance 155-22 is hereby amended by appropriating from the unappropriated balance the sum of $175,000. I believe that should be from sewer fund. So we just have one word missing there. 750.637, transaction code 500, and increasing the total appropriation by said amount. And section 3 indicates that service safety directors further authorized to expend up to $175,000 from sewer fund 750.637, transaction code 500 for said project 359. Finally, this ordinance shall be in full force and effect upon its passage and approval by the mayor.
Okay, thank you.
Should that be two? The appropriate, it's from unappropriated to the sewer fund.
So in section 2, saying that there's a word, two. Right here. Yep, thank you. Okay, so corrected. 7323 is an ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to advertise and accept bids for construction and construction engineering of the city sewer system improvements, which is project number 330, and declaring an emergency. Introduced by Councilmember McCary.
Thank you, President Isley. I will read for the record. Section 1, the Service Safety Director is hereby authorized to advertise and accept bids upon approval by the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, the OEPA, for construction and construction engineering of the city sewer improvements to include the Richland Lift Station, Gravity and Force Main sewers, the State Route 56 Lift Station, and the West Union to Richland Force Main, project number 330. Section 2 reads that this ordinance shall be an emergency measure necessary for the preservation of health, welfare, and safety of residents of the city of Athens, Ohio, in order that bids can be accepted as soon as the city receives OEPA approval to do so, and it shall be in full force and effect upon its passage and approval by the mayor.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to ordinance 7423. This is an ordinance authorizing the mayor to submit an application to participate in the state capital improvement and/or local transportation improvement programs for issue 1 funds, and to execute contracts as required. And this is introduced by Councilmember Reisner.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me read a portion of it. Whereas the State Capital Improvement Program and Local Transportation Improvement Program both provide financial assistance to political subdivisions for capital improvements to public infrastructure, be it ordained by the Council of the City of Athens, Ohio, Section 1, the mayor is hereby authorized to submit an application to the Ohio Public Works Commission, OPWC, to participate in the state capital improvement and/or local transportation improvement programs for issue 1 funds. Section 2, the mayor is further authorized to enter into any agreements as may be necessary and appropriate for obtaining this financial assistance.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. We'll next move on to ordinance 7523. This is an ordinance amending the 2023 appropriation ordinance 15522 and is introduced by Councilmember Crowell.
Thank you, President Isley. As mentioned at committee a little over an hour ago, we have a number of appropriations here, and I'll go ahead and read through those. The 2023 appropriation ordinance 155-22 is hereby amended by appropriating from the unappropriated balance the following sums: $54,500 to Street Fund 220, transaction code 400, for payment on the University Estates assessment; $50,000 to Sewer Fund 750.635, transaction code 500, for installation of a building to house the vac truck; $20,000 to Storm Sewer Fund 755.635, transaction code 200, for backfill material; and $50,000 to Storm Sewer Fund 755.635, transaction code 500, for repair of the Meadow Lane Storm Tunnel, and increasing the total appropriations by the same amounts. Thank you, President Isley.
Thank you. And we're think on our last ordinance for first reading tonight, 7623, an ordinance amending the 2023 staffing levels authorized by ordinance 14722, part-time and seasonal auxiliary patrol officers. And this is introduced by Councilmember Crown.
Thank you, President Isley. As discussed at committee, the staffing change seems to make a lot of sense. I'll go ahead and read section 1. An ordinance amending the 2023 staffing levels for part-time and seasonal auxiliary patrol officers, authorized by ordinance 147-22, to read as attached hereto and incorporated herein by reference. And you can see in the attachment the change of the part-time and seasonal employees to non-sworn auxiliary officers. And the starting pay is $1 less than for a full-time patrol officer. Thank you, President Isley.
Thank you. And before we adjourn, I just want to make an announcement that, yes, on June, we've mentioned it several times, but this Thursday, June 15th at 8 a.m., we'll be having a special session and then and also a public hearing about the ridges. And so encouraging anybody who wants to attend to make comments or ask questions about this or to submit in writing any kind of concerns they might have. And I now entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second?
Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And good evening, and we'll see